Thank you, Mr. President. Good morning, Senators. Over the last several days, we presented overwhelming evidence that establishes the charges in the article of impeachment. We've shown you how President Trump created a powder keg, lit a match, and then continued his incitement even as he failed to defend us from the ensuing violence. We've supported our position with images, videos, affidavits, documents, tweets, and other evidence, leaving no doubt that the Senate should convict. We believe we've proven our case. But last night, Congresswoman Jamie Herrera Butler of Washington State issued a statement confirming that in the middle of the insurrection, when House Minority Leader Kevin McCarthy called the president to beg for help, President Trump responded, and I quote, "Well, Kevin, I guess these people are more upset about the election than you are." Needless to say, this is an additional critical piece of corroborating evidence, further confirming the charges before you, as well as the president's willful dereliction of duty and desertion of duty as Commander-in-Chief of the United States, his state of mind, and his further incitement of the insurrection on January 6th. For that reason, and because this is the proper time to do so under the resolution that the Senate adopted to set the rules for the trial, we would like the opportunity to subpoena Congresswoman Herrera regarding her communications with House Minority Leader Kevin McCarthy, and to subpoena her contemporaneous notes that she made regarding what President Trump told Kevin McCarthy in the middle of the insurrection. We would be prepared to proceed by Zoom deposition of an hour or less, just as soon as Congresswoman Herrera Butler is available, and to then proceed to the next phase of the trial, including the introduction of that testimony shortly thereafter. Congresswoman Butler further stated that she hopes other witnesses to this part of the story, other patriots, as she put it, would come forward, and if that happens, we would seek the opportunity to take their depositions via Zoom, also for less than an hour, or to subpoena other relevant documents as well.
Mr. President, thank you. Senators, good morning. And good morning to the American people. The first thing I want to say on the issue of witnesses is that the House manager just got up here and described the articles of impeachment and the charges. There is no plural here. That's wrong. There's one article of impeachment and there's one charge, and that's incitement of violence and insurrection. What you all need to know and the American people need to know is, as of late yesterday afternoon, there was a stipulation going around that there weren't going to be any witnesses. But after what happened here in this chamber yesterday, the House managers realized they did not investigate this case before bringing the impeachment. They did not give the proper consideration and work. They didn't put the work in that was necessary to impeach the former president. But if they want to have witnesses, I'm going to need at least over 100 depositions, not just one. The real issue is incitement. They put into their case over 100 witnesses, people who have been charged with crimes by the federal government. And each one of those, they said that Mr. Trump was a co-conspirator with. That's not true. But I have the right to defend that. The only thing that I ask, if you vote for witnesses, do not handcuff me by limiting the number of witnesses that I can have. I need to do a thorough investigation that they did not do. I need to do the 911 style investigation that Nancy Pelosi called for. It should have been done already. It's a dereliction of the House manager's duty that they didn't. And now at the last minute, after a stipulation had apparently been worked out, they want to go back on that. I think that's inappropriate and improper. We should close this case out today. We have each prepared our closing arguments. I had 8 days to get ready for this thing. But we each had those 8 days equally together to prepare ourselves. And the House managers need to live the case that they brought. But if they don't, please, in all fairness and in all due process, do not limit my ability to discover the truth. That would be another sham. And that's the President's position, my position.
I should just have it standing by this. Mr. Ascott.
Thank you, Mr. President. First of all, this is the proper time that we were assigned to talk about witnesses. This is completely within the course of the rules set forth by the Senate. There's nothing remotely unusual about this. I think we've done an exceedingly thorough and comprehensive job with all the evidence that was available. Last night, this was breaking news, and it responded directly to a question that was being raised by the President's defense counsel, saying that we had not sufficiently proven to their satisfaction, although I think we've proven to the satisfaction of the American people, certainly, that the President, after the breach and the invasion took place, was not working on the side of defending the Capitol, but rather was continuing to pursue his political goals. And the information that came out last night by Congresswoman Butler, apparently backed up by contemporaneous notes that she had taken, I think will put to rest any lingering doubts raised by the President's counsel, who now says he wants to interview hundreds of people. There's only one person the President's counsel really needs to interview, and that's their own client. And bring him forward, as we suggested last week, because a lot of this is matters that are in his head. Well, why did he not act to defend the country after he learned of the attack? Why was he continuing to press the political case? But this piece of evidence is relevant to that.
If I may.
And finally, I was a little bit mystified by the point about the article of impeachment, which I referred to. The dereliction of duty, the desertion of duty, is built into the incitement charge, obviously. If the President of the United States is out inciting a violent insurrection, he's obviously not doing his job at the same time. Just like if a police officer is mugging you, yeah, he's guilty of theft and armed robbery, whatever it might be, but he's also not doing his job as a police officer, so it's further evidence of his intent and what his conduct is.
If I may.
Counsel?
First of all, it's my understanding, it's been reported that Mr. McCarthy disclaims the rumors that have been the basis of this morning's antics, but really the rumors that have been the basis of this entire proceeding. This entire proceeding is based on rumor, report, innuendo. There's nothing to it, and they didn't do their work. Just like what happened with Mr. Lee 2 or 3 nights ago, some supposed conversation had happened, and they had to withdraw that. They had to back off of that because it was false. It was a false narrative. But it is one article of impeachment. Yeah, they threw a lot of stuff in it in violation of Rule 23. Rule 23 says you cannot combine counts. It's a defect in their entire case. It's one of the 4 reasons why you can vote to acquit in this case. Jurisdiction, Rule 23, due process, and the First Amendment. They all apply in this case. Let me take my own advice and cool the temperature in the room a little bit. It's about the incitement. It's not about what happened afterwards. That's actually the irrelevant stuff. That's the irrelevant stuff. It's not the things that were said from the election to January 6th. It's not relevant to the legal analysis of the issues that are before this body. It doesn't matter what happened after the insurgents into the Capitol building, because that doesn't have to do with incitement. Incitement it's a point in time, folks. It's a point in time when the words are spoken and the words say, implicitly say, explicitly say, commit acts of violence or lawlessness. And we don't have that here. So for the House managers to say we need depositions about things that happened after, it's just not true. But if he does, there are a lot of depositions that need to be happened. Nancy Pelosi's deposition needs to be taken. Vice President Harris's deposition absolutely needs to be taken, and not by Zoom. None of these depositions should be done by Zoom. We didn't do this hearing by Zoom. These depositions should be done in person, in my office, in Philadelphia. That's where they should be done. I don't know how many civil lawyers are here, but that's the way it works, folks. When you want somebody's deposition, you send a notice of deposition, and they appear at the place where the notice says. That's civil process. I don't know why you're laughing. It is civil process. That is the way lawyers do it. We send notices of deposition. In the
I would remind everybody that we will have order in the chamber during these proceedings.
I haven't laughed at any of you, and there's nothing laughable here. He mentioned my client coming in to testify. That is not the way it's done. If he wanted to talk to Donald Trump, he should have put a subpoena down, like I'm going to slap subpoenas on a good number of people, if witnesses are what is required here for them to try to get their case back in order, which has failed miserably for 4 reasons. There is no jurisdiction here. There has been no due process here. They have completely violated and ignored and stepped on the Constitution of the United States. They have trampled on it like people who have no respect for it. And if this is about nothing else, it has to be about the respect of our country, our Constitution, and all of the people that make it up. And so that I ask, when considering or voting on this witness matter, and to be clear, this may be the time to do it, but again, and everybody needs to know, the backroom politics, I'm not so much into it all, and I'm not too adept at it neither. But there was a stipulation. They felt pretty comfortable after day 2, until their case was tested on day 3. Now is the time to end this. Now is the time to hear the closing arguments. Now is the time to vote your conscience. Thank you.
Mr. Raskin?
We were involved in no discussions about a stipulation, and I have no further comment. Thank you, Mr. President.
Position on that.
Would remind I would remind everybody, as Chief Justice Roberts noted on January 21st, 2020, citing the trial of Charles Swain in 1905, all parties in this chamber must refrain from using language that is not conducive to civil discourse. I listened to Chief Justice Roberts say that. I agreed with him, and I thought for our colleagues I would repeat it as I did last night. So the question we have before us is whether it shall be in order to consider and debate under the rules of impeachment any motion to subpoena witnesses or documents. The request for the yeas and nays has been made. Is there a sufficient second? There appears to be there is. The clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Baldwin. Mr. Barrasso. Mr. Bennett. Mrs. Blackburn. Mr. Blumenthal. Mr. Blunt. Mr. Booker. Mr. Bozeman. Mr. Braun. Mr. Brown. Mr. Burr. Ms. Cantwell. Mrs. Capito. Mr. Cardin. Mr. Carper. Mr. Casey. Mr. Cassidy. Ms. Collins. Mr. Coons. Mr. Cornyn. Ms. Cortez Masto. Mr. Cotton. Mr. Kramer. Mr. Crapo. Mr. Cruz. Mr. Daines. Ms. Duckworth. Mr. Durbin. Mr. Ernst. Ms. Ernst. Mrs. Feinstein. Mrs. Fisher. Mrs. Gillibrand. Mr. Graham. Mr. Grassley. Mr. Haggerty. Ms. Hassan. Mr. Hawley. Mr. Heinrich. Mr. Hickenlooper. Ms. Hirono. Mr. Hoven. Mrs. Hyde-Smith. Mr. Inhofe. Mr. Johnson. Mr. Kane. Mr. Kelly. Mr. Kennedy. Mr. King. Ms. Klobuchar. Mr. Lankford. Mr. Leahy. Mr. Lee. Mr. Lujan. Ms. Lummis. Mr. Manchin. Mr. Markey. Mr. Marshall. Mr. McConnell. Mr. Menendez. Mr. Merkley. Mr. Moran. Ms. Murkowski. Mr. Murphy. Mrs. Murray. Mr. Ossoff. Mr. Padilla. Mr. Paul. Mr. Peters. Mr. Portman. Mr. Reed, Mr. Risch, Mr. Romney, Ms. Rosen, Mr. Rounds, Mr. Rubio, Mr. Sanders, Mr. Sass, Mr. Schatz, Mr. Schumer, Mr. Scott of Florida, Mr. Scott of South Carolina, Mrs. Shaheen, Mr. Shelby, Ms. Sinema, Ms. Smith, Ms. Stabenow, Mr. Sullivan, Mr. Tester, Mr. Thune, Mr. Tillis, Mr. Toomey, Mr. Tuberville, Mr. Van Hollen, Mr. Warner, Mr. Warnock, Ms. Warren, Mr. Whitehouse, Mr. Wicker, Mr. Wyden, Mr. Young, Senators voting in the affirmative: Baldwin, Bennett, Blumenthal, Booker, Brown, Cantwell, Cardin, Carper, Casey, Collins, Coons, Cortez Masto, Duckworth, Durbin, Feinstein, Gillibrand, Hassan, Heinrich, Hickenlooper, Hirono, Kane, Kelly, King, Klobuchar, Leahy, Lujan, Manchin, Markey, Menendez, Merkley, Murkowski, Murphy, Murray, Ossoff, Padilla, Peters, Reed, Romney, Rosen, Sanders, Sass, Schatz, Schumer, Shaheen, Sinema, Smith, Stabenow, Tester, Van Hollen, Warner, Warnock, Warren, Whitehouse, Wyden. Senators voting in the negative: Barrasso, Blackburn, Blunt, Bozeman, Braun, Burr, Capito, Cassidy, Cornyn, Cotton, Kramer, Crapo, Cruz, Daines, Ernst, Fisher, Graham, Grassley, Haggerty, Hawley, Hoven, Hyde-Smith, Inhofe, Johnson, Kennedy, Langford, Lee, Lummis, Marshall, McConnell, Moran, Paul, Portman, Risch, Rounds, Rubio, Scott of Florida, Scott of South Carolina, Shelby, Sullivan, Thune, Tillis, Toomey, Tuberville, Wicker, Young.
Mr. President. I'd like to change my vote to aye.
Mr. Graham. Mr. Graham. Aye.
Mr. President,
Mr. Sullivan.
just a point of inquiry. There's a little confusion here. Was that a vote on one witness or many witnesses?
Debate is not allowed during the vote. I advise the
Not debate, it's a
Senator
point
from
of
Alaska.
inquiry. Mr. President, it's a point of inquiry on what we just voted on.
That is, I'm advised that is not allowed during the vote.
Can't know immediately before they start to cast.
Motions are not in order in a vote.
The points of order and debate are not allowed during the vote. That is established Senate procedure that we always follow.
Limits us to one vote or one subject.
I know.
On the question of whether it shall be in order to consider and debate under the rules of impeachment any motion to subpoena witnesses or documents, the motion is agreed to by a vote of 55 to 45. Majority Leader.
Mr. President,
Majority
I
Leader.
suggest the absence of a quorum.
Clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Baldwin.
Mr. President,
The Majority Leader.
I ask unanimous consent to vitiate the quorum call.
Without objection, so ordered.
Mr. President, as I understand it, there are discussions underway, and so I ask unanimous consent the Senate recess until 12:30 p.m.
Is there objection? Hearing none, we stand in recess till 12:30.
Thank you, Mr. President.
We Senate will be in order. Majority Leader, without objection, so ordered. Ms. Van Veen? No, Mr. Castor, I'm sorry.
May I be recognized?
Yes, you are. You are recognized.
Senators,
Glasses all fucked up.
Donald John Trump, by his counsel, is prepared to stipulate that if Representative Herrera Butler were to testify under oath as part of these proceedings, her testimony would be consistent with the statement she issued on February 12, 2021, and the former president's counsel is agreeable to the admission of that public statement into evidence at this time.
Thank you, Mr. Castor. Mr. Raskin.
Thank you, Mr. President. The managers are prepared to enter into the agreement. I will now read the statement. This is the statement of Congresswoman Jamie Herrera Butler, February 12, 2021. In my January 12th statement in support of the article of impeachment, I referenced a conversation House Minority Leader Kevin McCarthy relayed to me that he'd had with President Trump while the January 6th attack was ongoing. Here are the details. When McCarthy finally reached the president on January 6th and asked him to publicly and forcefully call off the riot, the president initially repeated the falsehood that it was Antifa that had breached the Capitol. McCarthy refuted that and told the president that these were Trump supporters. That's when, according to McCarthy, the president said, Well, Kevin, I guess these people are more upset about the election than you are. Since I publicly announced my decision to vote for impeachment, I have shared these details in countless conversations with constituents and colleagues and multiple times through the media and other public forums. I told it to the Daily News of Longview on January 17th. I've shared it with local county Republican executive board members, as well as other constituents who asked me to explain my vote. I shared it with thousands of residents on my telephone town hall on February 8th. Mr. President, I now move that the Senate admit the statement into evidence.
Objection, and without objection, the statement will be admitted into evidence. And does either party wish to make any further motions related to witnesses or documents at this time?
Mr. President, the President's counsel have no further motions.
Discuss.
And Mr. President, we have no further motions either.
Excuse me. Then the chair would note that neither party wishes to make further motions under Section 6 of Senate Resolution 47. Therefore, the next question is on admission of the evidence submitted by both parties pursuant to Section 8 of the resolution. The majority leaders recommend.
So now, as we move to another matter, I'm advised that the House managers have no objection to the admission of evidence proposed to be admitted by the former President's counsel under the provisions of Section 8 of Senate Resolution 47, and that the President's counsel have no objections to the evidence proposed to be admitted into evidence by the House managers. Pursuant to Section 8 of the resolution, as agreed to by Leader McConnell and myself a few days ago, both parties have made timely filings of this evidence with the Secretary of the Senate and have provided copies to each other. I therefore ask unanimous consent that the Senate dispense with the provisions of Section 8A of Senate Resolution 47 and that the materials submitted by both parties be admitted into evidence subject to the provisions of Section 8C of that resolution, which provides that the admission of this evidence does not constitute a concession by either party as to the truth of the matters asserted by the other party, and that each senator shall decide for him or herself the weight to be given such evidence. This request has the approval of both parties and the Republican leader.
Without objection, is so ordered. Okay, then pursuant to the provisions of Senate Resolution 47, the Senate has provided for up to 4 hours of closing arguments. They'll be equally divided between the managers on the part of the House of Representatives and the counsel for the former president. And pursuant to Rule 22 of the Rules of Procedure and Practice in the Senate, when sitting on impeachment trials, the argument shall be open and closed on the part of the House of Representatives. So the chair recognizes Mr. Manager Raskin to begin the presentation on the part of the House of Representatives. Mr. Raskin, under Rule 22, you may reserve time if you wish.
Thank you, Mr. President. Members of the Senate, before I proceed, it was suggested by defense counsel that Donald Trump's conduct during the attack, as described in Congresswoman Butler's statement, is somehow not part of the constitutional offense for which former President Trump has been charged. I want to reject that falsehood and that fallacy immediately. After he knew that violence was underway at the Capitol, President Trump took actions that further incited the insurgents to be more inflamed and to take even more extreme, selective, and focused action against Vice President Mike Pence. Former President Trump also, as described by Congressman Butler's notes, refused requests to publicly, immediately, and forcefully call off the riots. And when he was told that the insurgents inside the Capitol were Trump supporters, the president said, quote, "Well, Kevin, I guess these people are more upset about the election than you are." Think about that for a second. This uncontradicted statement that has just been stipulated as part of the evidentiary record. The president said, "Well, Kevin, I guess these people," meaning the mobsters, the insurrectionists, "are more upset about the election than you are." That conduct is obviously part and parcel of the constitutional offense that he was impeached for, namely incitement to insurrection. That is continuing incitement to the insurrection. The conduct described not only perpetuated his continuing offense, but also provides to us here today further decisive evidence of his intent to incite the insurrection in the first place. When my opposing counsel says that you should ignore the president's actions after the insurrection began, that is plainly wrong. And it, of course, reflects the fact that they have no defense to his outrageous, scandalous, and unconstitutional conduct in the middle of a violent assault on the Capitol that he incited. Senators, think about it for a second. Say you light a fire, and you're charged with arson. And the defense counsel says, everything that I did after the fire started is irrelevant. And the court would reject that immediately and say, that's not true at all. It's extremely relevant to whether or not you committed the crime. If you run over and try to put out the flames, if you get lots of water and say, help, help, there's a fire, if you call for help, a court will could infer that you didn't intend for the fire to be lit in the first place. They would accept your defense, perhaps, that it was all an accident. It was an all accident. Accidents happen with fire. But if, on the other hand, when the fire erupts, you go and you pour more fuel on it, you stand by and you watch it gleefully, any reasonable person will infer that you not only intended the fire to start, but that once it got started and began to spread, you intended to continue to keep the fire going. And that's exactly where we are, my friends. Of course your conduct while a crime is ongoing is relevant to your culpability, both to the continuation of the offense, but also directly relevant, directly illuminating to what your purpose was originally. What was your intent? And any court in the land would laugh out of court any criminal defendant who said, what I did after I allegedly killed that person is irrelevant to whether or not I intended to kill them. I mean, come on. Donald Trump's refusal not only to send help, but also to continue to further incite the insurgents against his own vice president provides further decisive evidence of both his intent to start this violent insurrection and his continued incitement once the attack had begun to override the Capitol. All right. Senators, that was in response to this new evidentiary particle that came in. But in my closing, I want to thank you for your remarkable attention and your seriousness of purpose befitting your office. We have offered you overwhelming and irrefutable and certainly unrefuted evidence that former President Trump incited this insurrection against us. To quote the statement Representative Liz Cheney made in January, quote, on January 6, 2021, a violent mob attacked the United States Capitol to obstruct the process of our democracy and stop the counting of presidential electoral votes. This insurrection caused injury, death, and destruction in the most sacred space in our republic. She continued. Representative Cheney continued. Much more will become clear in coming days and weeks, but what we know now is enough. The President of the United States summoned this mob, assembled this mob, and lit the flame of this attack. Everything that followed was his doing. None of this would have happened without the President. The president could have immediately and forcefully intervened to stop the violence. He did not. There has never been a greater betrayal by the President of the United States of his office and his oath to the Constitution. I will vote to impeach the president. Representative Cheney was right. She based her vote on the facts, on the evidence, and on the Constitution. And the evidence, the video, documentary, eyewitness has only grown stronger and stronger and more detailed right up till today, right up to 10 minutes ago, over the course of this Senate trial. And I have no doubt that you all noticed that despite the various propaganda reels and so on, President Trump's lawyers have said almost nothing to contest or overcome the actual evidence of former President Trump's conduct that we presented. Much less have they brought their client forward to tell us his side of the story. We sent him a letter last week, which they rejected out of hand. The former President of the United States refused to come and tell us, and I ask any of you, if you were charged with inciting violent insurrection against our country, and you were falsely accused, would you come and testify? I know I would. I'd be there at 7 o'clock in the morning waiting for the doors to open. I'm sure that's true of 100 senators in this room. I hope it's true of 100 senators in this room. Senate was lectured several times yesterday about cancel culture. Well, not even 2 weeks ago, the president's most reliable supporters in the House, I'm sorry, not the president, the former president's most reliable supporters in the House tried to cancel out Representative Cheney because of her courageous and patriotic defense of the Republic and the truth and the Constitution. They tried to strip her of her leading role as chair of the House Republican Conference. But you know what? I hope everybody takes a second to reflect on this. The conference rejected this plainly retaliatory and cowardly attempt to punish her for telling the truth to her constituents and her country and voting for impeachment. Who says you can't stand up against bullies? Who says? In my mind, Liz Cheney is a hero for standing up for the truth and resisting this retaliatory cancel culture that she was subjected to. But she beat them on a vote of 145 to 61, more than 2-to-1 vote. You know, Ben Franklin, a great champion of the Enlightenment, an enemy of political fanaticism and cowardice, and of course another great Philadelphian, once wrote this: I have observed that wrong is always growing more wrong until there is no bearing it anymore, and that right, however opposed, comes right at last. Comes right at last. Think about that. This is America, home of the brave, land of the free. The America of Ben Franklin, who said, if you make yourself a sheep, the wolves will eat you. Don't make yourself a sheep. The wolves will eat you. The America of Thomas Jefferson, who said at another difficult moment, a little patience and we shall see the reign of witches pass over, their spirits dissolve, and the people, recovering their true sight, restore their government to its true principles. The America of Tom Paine, who said, the mind once enlightened cannot again become dark. Now, we showed you hour after hour of real-time evidence demonstrating every step of Donald Trump's constitutional crime. We showed you how he indoctrinated the mob with his Orwellian propaganda about how the election he lost by more than 7 million votes and 306 to 232 in the electoral college, which he had described as a landslide when he won by the exact same margin in 2016, was actually a landslide victory for him being stolen away by a bipartisan conspiracy and fraud and corruption. We showed you how 61 courts and 88 judges, federal, state, local, trial, appellate, from the lowest courts in the land to the United States Supreme Court across the street, and 8 federal judges he himself named to the bench, all found no basis in fact or law for his outlandish, deranged inventions and concoctions about the election. In the meantime, President Trump tried to bully state-level officials to commit a fraud on the public by literally finding votes. We examined the case study of Georgia, where he called to threaten Republican Brad Raffensperger to find him 11,780 votes. That's all he wanted, he said. 11,780 votes. Don't we all? 11,780 votes. That's all he wanted to nullify Biden's victory and to win the election. Raffensperger ended up with savage death threats against him and his family, telling him he deserved a firing squad. Another election official urged Trump to cut it out or people would get hurt and killed. A prescient warning indeed. Raffensperger ended up saying that he and his family supported Donald Trump, gave him money, and now Trump threw us under the bus. We saw what happened in Lansing, Michigan, with the extremist mob he cultivated, which led to 2 shocking Capitol sieges and a criminal conspiracy by extremists to kidnap and likely assassinate Governor Whitmer. We saw him trying to get state legislatures to disavow and overthrow their popular election results and replace them with Trump electors. We showed you the process of summoning the mob, reaching out, urging people to come to Washington for a wild time. As we celebrate President's Day on Monday, imagine, is there another president in our history who would urge supporters to come to Washington for a wild time? You saw how he embraced the violent extremist elements like the Proud Boys, who were told in a nationally televised presidential candidate debate to stand back and stand by, which became their official slogan as they converged on Washington with other extremist and seditious groups and competed to be the lead stormtroopers of the attack on this building. You saw the assembly of the mob on January 6th, and how beautiful that angry mob must have looked to Donald Trump as he peered down from the lectern with the seal of the President of the United States of America emblazoned on it. That crowd was filled with extremists in tactical gear, armed to the teeth and ready to fight, and other brawling MAGA supporters. All of them saying, "Stop the steal right now." And he said he was going to march with them to the Capitol, even though the permit for the rally specifically forbade a march. But he said he would march with them, giving them more comfort that what they were doing was legitimate. It was okay. But of course he stayed back, as he presumably didn't want to be too close to the action at the Capitol, as the lawyers called it. Not an insurrection, they urged us yesterday. It's an action. He didn't want to be too close to the action when all hell was about to break loose. Now, incitement, as we've discussed, requires an inherently fact-based evidentiary inquiry. And this is what we did. We gave you many hours of specific factual details about, to use Congresswoman Cheney's words, how the president summoned the mob, assembled the mob, incited it, lit the match, sending them off to the Capitol, where they thought, as they yelled out, that they'd been invited by the President of the United States. And then, of course, they unleashed unparalleled violence against our overwhelmed and besieged but heroic police officers, who you thoughtfully honored yesterday when the officers got in their way as they entered the Capitol at the behest of the President of the United States to stop the steal. Now, I'm convinced most senators must be convinced by this overwhelming and specific detail, because most Americans are. But say you still have your doubts. You think the president really thought that he was sending his followers to participate in a peaceful, nonviolent rally, the kind that might have been organized by Julian Bond, who my distinguished opposing counsel brought up, Ella Baker, Bob Moses, our late beloved colleague John Lewis, for the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. Maybe the president really thought this was going to be like the March on Washington organized by Bayard Rustin and Dr. Martin Luther King, who said, nonviolence is the answer to the crucial moral and political questions of our time. So let's say you're still flirting with the idea that Donald Trump's conduct was totally appropriate, as he proclaimed right off the bat, and he's the innocent victim of a mass accident or a catastrophe like a fire or a flood, as we were invited to frame it on our opening day by distinguished co-counsel or opposing counsel. And you think, maybe we're just looking for somebody to blame for this nightmare and catastrophe that has befallen the Republic. We're just looking for someone to blame. Well, here's the key question then in resolving your doubts, if you're in that category. How did Donald Trump react when he learned of the violent storming of the Capitol and the threats to senators, members of the House, and his own vice president, as well as the images he saw on TV of the pummeling and beating and harassment of our police officers? Did he spring into action to stop the violence and save us? Did he even wonder about his own security, since an out-of-control anti-government mob could come after him too? Did he quickly try to get in touch with or denounce the Proud Boys, the Oath Keepers, the rally organizers, the Save America rally organizers, and everyone on the extreme right to tell them that this was not what he had in mind? It was a big mistake. Call it off, call it off, call it off, as Representative Gallagher begged him to do on national television? No. He delighted in it. He reveled in it. He exulted in it. He could not understand why the people around him did not share his delight. And then a long period of silence ensued while the mob beat the daylights out of police officers and invaded this building, as you saw on security footage, and proceeded to hunt down Vice President Mike Pence as a traitor and denounced and cursed Speaker Pelosi, both of whom you heard mob members say they wanted to kill. They were both in real danger. And our government could have been thrown into absolute turmoil without the heroism of our officers and the bravery and courage of a lot of people in this room. Here's what Republican Representative Anthony Gonzalez of Ohio said. He's a former pro football player. We are imploring the president to help, to stand up, to help defend the United States Capitol and the United States Congress, which is under attack. We are begging, essentially, and he was nowhere to be found. Nowhere to be found. As I've emphasized this morning, that dereliction of duty, that desertion of duty was central to his incitement of insurrection and inextricable from it. Inextricable. Bound together. It reveals his state of mind that day, what he was thinking as he provoked the mob to violence and further violence. It shows how he perpetuated his continuing offense on January 6th, his course of conduct charged in the article of impeachment as he further incited the mob during the attack, aiming it at Vice President Mike Pence himself, while failing to quell it in either of his roles as Commander-in-Chief or his real role that day, Inciter-in-Chief. And it powerfully demonstrates that the ex-president knew, of course, that violence was foreseeable, that it was predictable and predicted. That day, since he was not surprised and not horrified, no, he was delighted. And through his acts of omission and commission that day, he abused his office by siding with the insurrectionists at almost every point, rather than with the Congress of the United States, rather than with the Constitution. In just a moment, my colleague, Mr. Cicilline, will address President Trump's conduct, his actions and inactions, his culpable state of mind during the attack, as he will establish yesterday's explosive revelations about House Minority Leader Kevin McCarthy's desperate call to Trump and Trump's truly astounding reaction confirm that Trump was doing nothing to help the people in this room or this building. It's now clear beyond doubt that Trump supported the actions of the mob, and so he must be convicted. It's that simple. When he took the stage on January 6th, he knew exactly how combustible the situation was. He knew there were many people in the crowd who were ready to jump into action, to engage in violence at any signal that he needed them to fight like hell to stop the steal. and that's exactly what he told them to do. Then he aimed them straight here, right down Pennsylvania at the Capitol, where he told them that the steal was occurring, that is, the counting of the Electoral College votes. And we all know what happened next. They attacked this building, they disrupted the peaceful transfer of power, they injured and killed people, convinced that they were acting on his instructions and with his approval and protection. And while that happened, he further incited them while failing to defend us. If that's not ground for conviction, if that's not a high crime and misdemeanor against the Republic in the United States of America, then nothing is. President Trump must be convicted for the safety and security of our democracy and our people. Mr. Cicilline.
Mr. President, distinguished senators, as we've demonstrated, there is overwhelming evidence that President Trump incited the violence and knew violence was foreseeable on January 6th. He knew that many in the crowd were posed for violence at his urging. And in fact, many in the sea of thousands in the crowd were wearing body armor and helmets and holding sticks and flagpoles. And then he not only provoked that very same crowd, but aimed them at the Capitol. He literally pointed at this building, at us, during his speech. He pointed to the building where Congress was going to certify the election results and where he knew the vice president himself was presiding over the process. Now, no one is suggesting that President Trump intended every detail of what happened on January 6th. But when he directed the sea of thousands before him, who were reportedly ready to engage in real violence, when he told that crowd to fight like hell, he incited violence targeted at the Capitol, and he most certainly foresaw it. My colleague, Manager Dean, will stand up after me and walk you through the overwhelming evidence that supports those claims. I want to start, though, by talking about what happened after that. There was a lot of discussion yesterday about what the president knew and when he knew it. There are certain things that we do not know about what the president did that day, because the president, that is former President Trump, has remained silent about what he was doing during one of the bloodiest attacks on our Capitol since 1812. Despite a full and fair opportunity to come forward, he's refused to come and tell his story. As Manager Raskin said, we would all do that. In fact, I would insist on it. If I were accused of a grave and serious crime that I was innocent of, I would demand the right to tell my side of the story. President Trump declined. But there are certain facts that are undisputed, that we know to be true despite the president's refusal to testify, which his counsel either ignored entirely or didn't and couldn't dispute. Before I go to those facts, let me quickly just touch on a few things. First, President Trump and his counsel have resorted to arguments that the evidence presented was somehow manufactured or hidden from them. And I want to be very clear about this because this is important. In terms of the timing of when they received materials here, defense counsel had access to all materials when they were entitled to have them under Senate Resolution 47. And they cannot and have not alleged otherwise. As to their desperate claim that evidence was somehow manufactured, they have not alleged that one tweet from their client was actually inaccurate, nor can they. We got these tweets, which are, of course, statements from the former president, from a public archive, and they are all correct. You also know the president's claims about evidence being manipulated also are untrue because they didn't even object to the introduction of the evidence when they had the opportunity to do so. So I hope we can now set those issues aside and turn to the facts of this case and really set the record straight about the undisputed facts in this case, about what the president knew that day and when he knew it. And at the outset, let me say this. As you may recall, in direct response to a question yesterday, President Trump's counsel stated, and I quote, "At no point was the president informed the vice president was in any danger," end quote. As we walk through these undisputed facts, you will see quite clearly that is simply not true. As you can see here, from just after 12 p.m. to just before 2 p.m., President Trump delivered his statements at the rally, which incited an initial wave of protesters coming down to the Capitol. And his speech was still ongoing, and you saw the evidence of people broadcasting that on their phones. He finished his speech at about 1:11 p.m., at which point a much larger wave surged toward us here at the Capitol, ripping down scaffolding and triggering calls for law enforcement assistance. 30 minutes later, at 1:49 p.m., as the violence intensified, President Trump tweeted a video of his remarks at the rally with the caption, quote, "Our country has had enough. We will not take it anymore, and that's what this is all about," end quote. During the half hour following that tweet, the situation here drastically deteriorated. Insurrectionists breached the Capitol barriers, then its steps, then the complex itself. By 2:12, the insurrectionist mob had overwhelmed the police and started their violent attack on the Capitol. And as you all know, this attack occurred and played out on live television. Every major network was showing it. We've shown you during the course of this trial, side by side, exactly what the president would have seen on TV or his Twitter account. We've also shown you that he would have seen around 2:12 p.m. images of Vice President Pence being rushed off the Senate floor. Now, I won't replay all of that for you, but for timing purposes, here's the footage reacting to Vice President Pence leaving the floor.
No audio. They just cut out. It looks like they and sometimes the Senate
like they just ushered Mike Pence out really quickly.
Yes, they did. That's exactly what just happened there. And they ushered Mike Pence out. They moved him fast. I saw the motions too.
Defense counsel seems to suggest that somehow the President of the United States was not aware of this, that the President had no idea that his Vice President had been evacuated from the Senate floor for his safety because violent rioters had broken into the Capitol, with thousands more coming, and with the Capitol Police completely overwhelmed. This was on live television. So defense counsel is suggesting that the President of the United States knew less about this than the American people. This is just not possible. That the Secret Service failed to mention that his Vice President was being rushed from the Senate for his own protection. That nobody in the White House thought to alert him. That none of our law enforcement agencies raised a concern to the Commander-in-Chief that the Vice President was being evacuated from the Senate floor as a violent mob assaulted the Capitol. That simply cannot be. And with each passing minute on the timeline of events on January 6th, it grows more and more inconceivable. Let's continue forward in time. Between 2:12 to 2:24, the Senate recessed. Speaker Nancy Pelosi was ushered off the floor. The Capitol Police announced a breach and a lockdown, and the insurrectionist mob began chanting, "Hang Mike Pence." And it was unfolding on live TV in front of the entire world. So again, let me ask you, does it strike you as credible that nobody, not a single person, informed the President that his Vice President had been evacuated, or that the President didn't glance at the television or his Twitter account and learn about the events that were happening? Remember, this was the day of the Electoral College. Remember his obsession with stopping the certification. It's just not credible that the President at no point knew his Vice President was in this building and was in real danger. Senators, I submit to you these facts. This timeline is undisputed. At 2:24 p.m., after rioters breached the barriers, after calls for assistance, after rioters stormed the building, after Vice President Pence was rushed from the Senate floor, and just before Vice President Pence was further evacuated for his safety, President Trump decided to attack his own Vice President on Twitter. The undisputed facts confirm that not only must President Trump have been aware of the Vice President's danger, but he still sent out a tweet attacking him, further inciting the very mob that was in just a few feet of him inside of this very building. The vice president was there with his family. He was in danger for his life. They were chanting, "Hang Mike Pence," and had erected a noose outside. And as we've shown, the mob responded to President Trump's attack instantly. The tweet was read aloud on a bullhorn, if you remember that video. Insurrectionists began chanting again about Mike Pence. And in those critical moments, we see President Trump engaging in a dereliction of his duty by further inciting the mob in real time to target the vice president with knowledge that the insurrection was ongoing. And that's, of course, included in the conduct charged in this article of impeachment. The former president's counsel's suggestion otherwise is completely wrong. His further incitement is impeachable conduct that continued during the course of this assault itself, and it's part of the constitutional crime and was entirely and completely a part of his indefensible failure to protect the Congress. Now, there's been some confusion as to the phone call I referenced with Senator Lee. So I want to be clear about certain facts that are not in dispute. First, Senator Lee has confirmed that the call occurred at 2:26 p.m., so I've added that to the timeline above. Remember, by this phone call, the vice president has just been evacuated on live television for his own safety. And Donald Trump had, after that, tweeted an attack on him, which the insurgents read on a bullhorn. And a few minutes after Donald Trump's tweet, he didn't reach out to check on the vice president's safety. He called a senator to ask about delaying the certification. The call was interrupted. As Senator Tuberville has since explained, and I quote, "I looked at the phone and it said the White House on it. I said, hello. The president said a few words. I said, Mr. President, they're taking the vice president out and they want me to get off the phone and I've got to go," end quote. That was his second evacuation that day. A minute later, live feeds documented the insurgents chanting, "Mike Pence is a traitor." At this point, even if somehow he'd missed it earlier, it's inconceivable that the former president, was unaware that the vice president was in danger. And what does the president do after hearing that? Does he rush to secure the Capitol? Does he do anything to quell the mob? Does he call his vice president to check on his safety? We all know the answer to those questions too. There can be no dispute. He took none of those steps, not a single one. Even after learning that senators were being evacuated and that Vice President Pence had also been evacuated, he did nothing to help the vice president. And here's some more evidence that we've since learned. At some point over the following 30 minutes, President Trump spoke to Minority Leader Kevin McCarthy. And as Representative Jamie Herrera Butler has revealed, evidence that now has been stipulated as part of the evidentiary record. In that conversation, Kevin McCarthy is pleading with the former president to do something. He first tries to assign the blame to another group, and Leader McCarthy says, "No, these are your supporters, Mr. President." And what does the president say in response? Not, "I'll send people right away. I didn't realize you were in danger." He says, "Well, Kevin," and I quote, "Well, Kevin, I guess these people are more upset about the election than you are," end quote. I guess these people are more upset about the election than you are. The president, just as he conveyed in that tweet at 6:01, was essentially saying, "You got what you deserve." Let me say that again. Not only was the president fully aware of the vice president's situation and the situation that we were all in when he was asked for help, when he was asked to defend the Capitol less than 30 minutes after inciting this violence against his own vice president, President Trump refused that request for assistance. And he told us why. his singular focus stopping the certification of the election of his opponent. He incited the violence to stop the certification. He attacked the vice president and further incited the insurrection to pressure the vice president to stop the certification. He called Senator Tuberville to stop the certification, and he refused to send help to Congress. And this Congress and the vice president of the United States were in mortal danger because he wanted to stop the certification. And he did these things, attacking the vice president, calling Senator Tuberville, refusing Representative McCarthy's request, with full knowledge of the violent attack that was underway at that point. He chose retaining his own power over the safety of Americans. I can't imagine more damning evidence of his state of mind. The call ended with a screaming match interrupted by violent rioters breaking through the windows of Representative McCarthy's office. Senators, the president knew this was happening. He didn't do anything to help his vice president or any of you or any of the brave officers and other employees serving the American people that day. His sole focus was stealing the election for himself. And he apparently has still not thought of anyone else. According to more new facts revealed last night, the vice president's team does not agree with the president's counsel or the president's counsel's assessment either. The report, and I quote, says, Pence's team does not agree with the Trump lawyer's assessment that Trump was concerned about Pence's safety. Trump didn't call him that day or for 5 days after that. No one else on Trump's team called as Pence was evacuated to one room in a number with screaming mob nearby.
Objection, this is not in evidence. Objection, this is not in evidence. If you wanted a stipulation to this...
The counsel will sit down.
Senators, remember when...
Chair has no way of knowing what material is evidence or not. The counsel for the president will have a chance to speak. And the chair will consider the issue.
Senators, remember, as one of you said during this attack, they could have killed us all. Our staff, the officers protecting all of us, everyone. And President Trump not only incited it, but continued inciting it as it occurred with attacks on his vice president, and then willfully refused to defend us, furthering his provocation and incitement by the mob, siding with the mob, siding with the violent insurrectionists, criminals who killed and injured police officers sworn to protect us because they were, quote, more upset about the election than Leader McCarthy. Those facts are undisputed. President Trump has not offered any evidence or any argument to disprove them. His lawyers almost entirely ignored these facts in their short presentation. We have only his counsel's false claim yesterday that, quote, at no point was the president informed that the vice president was in any danger, end quote. A claim that is refuted not just by common sense, but by the timeline you have seen and also the vice president's legal team. So there can be no doubt that at the moment we most needed a president to preserve, protect, and defend us, President Trump instead willfully betrayed us. He violated his oath. He left all of us and officers like Eugene Goodman to our own devices against an attack he had incited and he alone could stop. That is why he must be convicted. And I'd like to conclude by making one final point that follows directly from what I just discussed. Our case and the article of impeachment before you absolutely includes President Trump's dereliction of duty on January 6th. His failure as inciter-in-chief to immediately quell or call off the mob, his failure as commander-in-chief to immediately